Hello, I'm Grant Bartley. In this video, I'm going to argue that even the most basic knowledge of the brain and the mind, and of the meaning of the words mental and physical, tells us that our minds and brains are different, and that our minds are not physical. By mind and the mental, I mean subjective awareness or experience and its contents. Specifically, I'm going to argue that the mind being produced by the brain is not enough to conclude that the mind is the brain. How could it be, though? The product of something is never the same as the thing that produced it. The brain producing the mind, by definition, means the brain has made something other than itself. Minds are produced by a physical object, the brain, or more correctly, central nervous system, doing physical activities, but minds are not physical objects. It's important to get this right because the most fundamental division of types of stuff in the world is revealed in the difference between the mind and the brain. If we get the fundamental division of reality wrong, our understanding of reality is fundamentally wrong. So let's get the fundamental division of reality right. This fundamental division tells us that the material and the mental are two distinct aspects of reality. The popular lie that the mind is just the brain has immediate major practical implications too. For instance, it has significant consequences for psychiatry and psychology. Obliterating the conceptual distinction between the mind and the brain, or between mind and matter, might eliminate the conceptual distinction between whether a mental health problem is physically originated due to brain dysfunction or damage, or mentally originated due to traumatic experience. So materialism can have dangerous implications for appropriate treatment. We don't want to mistakenly think that everything's physical, so requires a physical cure. We don't want to think that the mind is just nervous system chemistry, leave it to medication or surgery. Although brain damage or bad brain chemistry often ought to be physically treated, bad experiences would usually better have a talking or other behavioural modification cure. Neuroscience gives us good reason to believe that every aspect of your mind is generated by your brain. The existence and functioning of every aspect of my conscious experience, every facet of my awareness, from my sensations to my moods to my thoughts, imaginings and dreams, is dependent on my brain activity. I'll call this the mind-brain connection principle. I think this principle is true. Indeed, whatever position a philosopher of mind takes on the nature of mind, they nearly all recognize that every part of your experience is correlated with brain activity. We're interested in what this correlation between the mind and the brain means. What is the nature of the mind connected to the brain? Is the mind physical or something else? And if so, what? Note here, though, that the nature of mind, the what of mind, is not what is explored by neuroscience. Neuroscience is instead concerned with the details of how the mind connects to the brain. The connection between the mind and the brain is already established. So the issue of the nature of mind is not a question of neuroscience establishing links between the mind and the brain, even to the point of shadowy corporations being able to create artificial self-aware minds through artificial brains. The issue of the nature of mind is instead a question of the definition of the concepts of mental and physical. Conceptual analysis is the domain of philosophy, not science. And the nature of mind is that it is distinctly, radically non-physical, both in character and in substance. Let me break it down in case you can't see the elephant of experience in the room of your mind. Indeed, consider an elephant. Like every other thing you've ever seen, this image of an elephant is springing into your mind as a result of brain activity primarily in your visual cortex. This brain activity is electricity flowing along nerve wires causing the release of chemicals affecting electrical and chemical activity in further neurons. But this does mean that when, for example, you're seeing or thinking an image of an elephant's trunk, there's nothing in your brain that looks like an elephant's trunk. Neither, incidentally, is there anything that sounds like an elephant's call across the savannah, echoing around your brain's auditory areas whenever you hear or dream that. Indeed, there's nothing that looks, sounds, feels, smells, or tastes like an elephant in the requisite parts of your brain whenever you evoke any such mammoth phantasms. But how do you tell anything apart from anything else? Don't we know one thing is a different thing from something else precisely through their different properties? Isn't that the only way, indeed? Consider a hippo and the Eiffel Tower. How do we know they're different things except through their properties? Specifying which sort of thing we're talking about via its properties is a fundamental means of distinguishing one thing from another. It's an application of one of Leibniz's laws. Gottfried Leibniz posited the law of the identity of indiscernibles, which, to violently paraphrase it, is the idea that different sets of properties mean different things. It's clear that the mind and the brain do have utterly different sets of properties. According to Leibniz's very plausible law, the mind and the brain can't be the same. So, one simple argument that the mind and the brain must be different is that mental contents are utterly distinct from the brains that generate those contents. It gets even worse for the materialists, though. I see a contradiction here between the properties of your brain and the properties of your mind and its contents. Your brain's activities are nothing like your image of an elephant, whereas your image of the elephant in your experience is precisely like itself. The properties of your mind and the properties of your brain are not only different then, they are logically incompatible or mutually exclusive to each other. How could they be the same thing? It's absurd and thoughtless to say that they're the same. Someone might respond that maybe the mind isn't the same as the brain, but that the mind must nevertheless be a physical thing, since it is generated by the brain, which is a physical thing. Well, what does it mean for something to be a physical thing? At the very least, for something to be physical must mean that it has physical properties. It won't have all the physical properties possible for a physical thing to have, but a physical thing needs at least some set of physical properties. Clearly and demonstrably, the mind and its contents are not physical things. Why not? Well, because your mind and its contents have no physical properties. Physical objects, if they're observable at all, are observable by many people. But thoughts are observable only to the mind having them. Or another difference is, physical objects take up physical space, while thoughts do not take up physical space. If thoughts occupied physical space, we would see them when we looked in the brain. Descartes noted this second difference between minds and brains 400 years ago. People with materialist agendas skated over this blatant and undeniable distinction then, just as they'll do now. Your brain has physical properties. This is why we call it a physical thing. However, minds and their contents have no physical properties. If your mind and its experiences have no physical properties, how could they be physical things? Once again, I'd put this argument in extreme terms. Mental things such as minds, experiences, fantasies and thoughts have not just different properties from physical things such as brains, but their properties are logically incompatible. For instance, the thoughts you're having can't be touched, whereas the brain generating them could be touched. Tangible and intangible are clearly logically incompatible properties. So, purely logically speaking, minds and their contents can't be physical things. If you think this must be wrong, ask yourself, what physical properties do thoughts have? Suppose then we allow that minds and brains have different sets of properties, which we'll call mental and physical properties. You might still reasonably ask, can't the mental and physical properties be different sets of properties for the brain itself? Why does this difference in properties for the mind and the brain mean we're dealing with two fundamentally different things? Because material things such as brains and mental things such as minds are different types of substance. A substance is what something is ultimately made of. For instance, the substance of anything material is matter, whatever that turns out to be. What is the substance of mind? Isn't that matter too? To answer this, let's start with the question, what's an experience made of? There's a crucial difference between a cake being made by a chef and a cake being made of a chef. In just the same way, experience is made by brains, but not of brains. Each experience must be what is experienced, but this means that the exact nature of each experience is the experience itself. In other words, the substance of experience is experience. Experience is made of experience. The fact that the mind is produced by the brain is not enough to say that the mind is physical. Let me make an analogy with taps. Just because a tap produces water is not enough to say that the water is the same stuff as the tap. So it is with the production of consciousness by brains. Just because the mind is produced by the brain, this doesn't mean that the mind is the same sort of stuff as the brain producing it. Why should it? People who believe that the mind is physical are called physicalists or materialists. Physicalists need to assume that because it was produced by a brain, the mind is physical. This is a reason for which there is no justification. Indeed, the assumption that the mind is physical just because it was produced by something physical is false. If despite these points you still think that the mind is physical, my question to you would be, if the mind doesn't have the properties physical things have, what do you mean when you say that the mind is physical? How do you define the mind to make it physical? I myself am logically convinced there are no definitions of the concepts of physical and mental that plausibly make the mind physical. What makes a thing physical is it being made of physical stuff. The evidence of it being made of physical stuff is its physical properties. The mind is not a physical thing according to this very basic definition. Instead, the mind is a mental thing. Minds are different types of things from brains. Minds are, however, intimately connected with brains. I call this position on the nature of the mind-brain relationship naturalistic dualism. It's naturalistic because it says that experience is created through the activity of the brain, but it's dualistic because it says that the mental content so created and the brain doing the creating are fundamentally different things. If you're uncomfortable with the term dualism, you might free your mind from Descartes' ghost by seeing that naturalistic dualism allows for the dependence of the mind on the activity of the central nervous system. It also allows for minds to be produced through activity other than central nervous system activity, although the limits of what a mind could be embodied in have not yet been determined. Even while recognizing the intimate connection between the mind and the brain, recognizing that the mind is distinct from anything physical is recognizing that something non-physical exists, which is mental rather than material in properties and substance. Therefore, reality is only properly understood to have both material and mental aspects to it. If your world doesn't include distinctly mental stuff, such as minds and their contents, then your world is missing half of reality. Thank you.